So I do not talk about kids' fantasy a whole lot here on the channel. I've reviewed and discussed a couple series throughout the 4 years of me being here, but getting into the hardcore, this is targeted at a younger audience, not even young adult, but child audience, is something I've not done. And I was planning on eventually getting around to that. Some recommendations for the kids in the crowd who might really enjoy some of these better than a lot of people perceive them to be kids' fantasy books. But that got pushed way up my to-do list when I got a message on Patreon, essentially telling me there was a 9-year-old granddaughter to this patron who was being discouraged to read inadvertently from their father, but absolutely loved Harry Potter, and they were afraid, what could I give them next? How could I keep them addicted to reading fantasy if, the parent might not give it to them, and I don't know the genre that well? I'm gonna solve your problem right now, because that is a horrific issue, and I am not going to let this little 9-year-old stop with Harry Potter. Well, Harry Potter is great, it's not a full education in fantasy, and we need to keep the kids addicted to reading. This is the most important video I've ever made, and I'm going to do it well and do it right. So this is the video of what you should give your younger one, or if you're a younger one, what you should read after Harry Potter, because I know there are a lot of people who just read and reread Harry Potter, and that's fine, it's great. I love y'all, you're still definitely a valid part of the fantasy community, but where do you go next? What are some recommendations that might entice a reader in the age range of like 9 to 13? This is what I'm shooting for. I don't know kids that well, but I know fantasy, so I did my best. I asked my dad what he recommends, because he certainly helped raise a fantasy addict, so something there's gotta translate. Let's get going. Best fantasy books for that age range, starting now. Now, the obvious recommendation, if you find it to be okay and appropriate for your child after reading Harry Potter, is His Dark Materials. I'm aware there are some people who will not give this to their child because of its anti-religious theming, and that's okay. I'm not trying to convert anybody here, but outside of those themes, this is one of the most addicting series for kids to get into, in my opinion, especially right in that age range. It has a protagonist that is just like them, they can totally relate to. There are demon little creatures that follow around the protagonist that are their soul's exterior, that give them these moral guidings. Brilliantly done. The atmosphere and world is deep and rich enough for a kid to get completely lost in, and I think it's just a very natural step, a natural progression from Harry Potter to level up a little bit in fantasy and go for something that has a little more real-world reflection in terms of its themes. It wasn't even originally written to be targeted at a younger audience, but it absolutely does fit. They can enjoy it, they can read it, and get just as much out of it, in my opinion, as the older crowd. If they're really smart, they might actually come to you with some questions like, hey, let's have a discussion about this thing that's in this book, and if I was a parent, I'd be thrilled if that happened. Now though, what if you're like, no, I want my kid to get into classic fantasy, I want them to get into real fantasy, not like a alternative fantasy, not something that's different. I want like sword and sorcery fantasy to be something for them to step on into, because hey, if you want them to be a lifelong fantasy reader, getting them into sword and sorcery right now is definitely a way to go. Start the addiction, get them hooked. There are 2 routes to go there, both valid. One I weight a little more than the other, and that's Eragon, the Inheritance Cycle, or A Wizard of Earthsea. A Wizard of Earthsea is definitely going to hook some kids who are willing to be addicted to fantasy right away. It has those lofty fantasy tropes done oh so well. Le Guin's writing style is enjoyable across like all age ranges. It's not that she dumbs anything down, it's just very digestible, and it's one of the best things I've read in fantasy altogether, especially something that doesn't divorce too far from the classic fantasy roots. So if you want to set them up to be a die-hard fantasy nerd in terms of just the way the genre is in its history and the way it's progressing now, this is really a sweet spot to hit. But if you're still more concerned of, yeah, I want them to get into fantasy, but something that's more aimed towards kids and just like a fantasy book that is in their vein through and through, it's the way to go. Eragon picks that up for me, because yes, it does have every fantasy trope in the book, but it is more divorced in some ways from actually just paying deep respects and being so ingrained in the fantasy genre in my mind, because it takes some things that Christopher Paolini inadvertently did as a 15-year-old when he wrote it that I think kind of separate it in certain ways. It's written in such a modern and simplistic fashion, just because he wrote it when he was 15, that's kind of unavoidable, that it might be something they relate to more, and being able to sell it to them as a fantasy reader, a young fantasy reader, of, hey, this was written by someone who's just a couple years older than you, might definitely get them interested. In terms of lofty theming or anything like that, not a whole lot in Eragon. It's the standard friends, family, fate. Those are really the focal point of this story. And in terms of children that might be leaning more towards the action-packed, the typical journey of, farm boy to hero, you really can't go wrong with Eragon there, and especially because they're not well enough read fantasy people at this point to be spotting that's from Wheel of Time, that's from Lord of the Rings, that's from Star Wars, which again, I'm not giving Christopher Paolini crap for. He wrote it so young, that's just, that's expected and fine. So a Wizard in Earthsea if they're ready for really the traditional fantasy approach, and Eragon if they just want to get into all the tropes, you want to educate them on where the genre is going, and something that might be a bit more relatable to them from the start. Daniel, you're not helping me at all. These are all things I know. Well, my next recommendation is not quite as well known in the mainstream, but is definitely well known among fantasy diehards, and is one I deeply recommend to people because it's cute, it has some darker moments, it is well-rounded, and it's very original, and that is Redwall. It teaches your children the real lessons of life. It's not mice that are the enemy, it's not cats. It's snakes. Snakes are the enemy. No question. I hate snakes, and Redwall will teach your kid that without a doubt. This is, though, a surprisingly rich mine for your child to start digging into in terms of characterization, in terms of the plots that unfurl, and the messaging towards kids, working with those you might not get along with, having this more well-rounded view on the world. And I've recently gone back and read some of Redwall, and there's really some great messages there in terms of being accepting, maybe possibly working with people you didn't used to get along with, and that's all really prevalent in those pages, and I enjoy a lot. So if your kids especially like the cute animal approach, with his Dark Materials also might have for them because of the demons, Redwall I can't recommend enough. I feel like it's dying out slowly. The younger generation hasn't really heard of and read a whole lot of Redwall, and I really want to push against that because I find it to be one of the best stories I remember from my childhood, and I'm sad I don't have any of the Redwall books on my shelf. I really need to get them again. I have no idea where they ended up. In fact, I might say here without a doubt, in terms of most mass appeal, and one that I think just across the boards kids will enjoy without a question in my mind, Redwall might take the cake, and I mean that. I think it's such a well done series. If you look up Redwall online, it says for ages 12 and up. I'm not much in a perspective to give commentary on that, but I don't remember anything that would scar a 9-year-old picking up Redwall. There's some violence, but it's like animals, and it's certainly not as disturbing as Watership Down in my mind, but that's just my take on that. There's definitely just also the classics choice that often get overlooked because they're seen as kid books, but I think someone in this age range, in fact, going back and rereading them, can definitely pull more out. I think kids in this age range are more perceptive than we might think at times, and definitely Alice in Wonderland is something that, especially if your kid might be into absurdism, which kids often are, they really have the imagination to just kind of accept and fully grasp and roll with a lot of the bold choices taken with absurdist stories. Could be something that I would hand your kid and say, hey, roll with it. See the adult things they can pick out of it. There's also The Little Prince, which, yes, is a kid's book, but I think across all age ranges can be thoroughly enjoyed, though if you're trying to get them to be a continual reader, they'll burn that one through in a day, and that wouldn't help a whole lot there, but it could be something to inspire them to read more down the road. The Last Unicorn is critically heralded and praised, but I want to focus more on series. So while all those were nice, they aren't series, and they'll just kind of be another thing for your young reader to have under their belt. And there's one consistent thing that several of these past books have had at the forefront of their story that really does charm kids into reading them, and that's that it's kids versus adults. And that really is a big selling point to kids. Who are we kidding? They love that. And this next recommendation may not be for a 9-year-old. You might need to wait from more 11 to 12, but I don't know if that's entirely the case. You're your own judge. I don't know what is appropriate for your kid. But A Series of Unfortunate Events is not necessarily fantastical, though there's definitely a lot of absurdism in there, and some people just think those genres overlap. I just have a very big sweet spot for them, and this is my recommendation for, hey, I don't really care if it's fantasy, I just want my kid reading, which is absolutely allowed, and I'm really just trying to encourage kids to read in general. And this one, I don't know a kid around 10, 11, 12 who picked up A Series of Unfortunate Events and didn't just burn through book after book after book after book. They are full of personality, the characters are rich, the bad guy adults actually teach your children learn a lot of good lessons of how to avoid a creep. And for me, the adaptations have never done the source material justice. So I would steer your kids away from the adaptations because they're just not as good as the books, not even close in my mind. Sorry, Neil Patrick Harris. And I would just put the first one in front of them and say, go with it. There are some sadder moments. There are some real like gut punches here for a reader, but I think that's absolutely great for a kid to experience at a young age. Let them kind of go through some more adult emotion through fiction before they may encounter it in their real life. And A Series of Unfortunate Events does not pull its punches, which I actually appreciate. It's still definitely aimed at kids, but it just kind of is honest with them in a way I really appreciate. Same with a few of the series I mentioned here. But that is my recommendations for getting your kids either into fantasy or absurdism, just really keeping them reading, because let's be honest, that's really important here. And it's an important topic I haven't covered on the channel as much as I really should have. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts. I'd love, this is a really sincere like plea for the comment section. Let me know and let other people know, because I want more parents to be reading the comment section here as well. What books did you read as a kid that stuck with you, that got you to read more and got you to be the fantasy nerd you are here today? And any parents watching, go in those comment sections, see what people have to say, because I'm not the most well-read in kids' books. Really, this is like the only series I really loved are the ones I talked about here. I don't have a whole lot more in the chamber in terms of series I can dearly recommend for young readers. And if you're a young reader, let me know what you're reading now that is really capturing you. Maybe some of the newer stuff, because a lot of the stuff I mentioned is older. I'm not aware of what's new and grabbing an audience. So I'd love to have some of the younger people in the audience who are of the 12, 13 range. Leave some comments. Let me know what series are absolutely captivating your peers and yourself. I'll be reading through and looking for them and maybe even reviewing them here on the channel. Anyway, guys, like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here, and have a good one, y'all. Peace.